Hey everyone, welcome back to the Acid Horizon podcast. I will keep today's intro quick. If you are listening on the weekend of January 18th or 19th, on Monday at 11 a.m., for those people who get up early in the morning on a weekdays, maybe have that weekday off, we're going to do something called Libidinal Lunch in the Discord server called the Schizoanalysis Project. And we're going to have an informal discussion of themes from Chapter 1 of Anti-Oedipus, including desiring production, the body without organs, and so forth. I have it linked to the Schizoanalysis Project in the show notes, and please go ahead and click that to join. And as you do so, become a member of our Patreon, where you can then join the Anti-Oedipus Files. Today we have a fantastic guest, someone who many of you already know, and that is Jason Bahbak Mohaghegh, to talk about his new short book, Evil, a study of lost techniques. Let's hop in. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the Evil podcast. For millennia, philosophers pondered the problem of evil, probing the paradoxes looming behind the notion of a negativity infusing every corner of the cosmos. And despite any of their achievements, or perhaps even because of some of them in some cases, the image of evil persists, or should I say, it thrives in our world, enjoying an apocalyptic tenure in our predominantly secular age. But rather than probing the essence of evil ontologically today, our focus turns to a different research: the lost techniques of evil, its organization as a series of principles, its diagrammatic coordinates, its archival aspect, and its correspondence with clandestine geographies. With us today, we have the inimitable Jason Bahbak Mohaghegh, who has returned to our podcast to guide us on another descent into the underworld with a glimpse of his newest piece of writing, Evil, a study of lost techniques. Forthcoming from Scarlett Press, Jason is also the author of Omnicide 1 and its companion Omnicide 2, out on Urbanomic Press, among many other fantastic books we have discussed in the past. Jason, it's a pleasure to have you back on the podcast. We have been craving a dose of your magic for more than a minute.
Oh, be careful what you wish for, but thank you very much. I'm honored to be among good friends again.
Well, for this particular podcast, I made a certain promise to myself coming to this episode that I would try to avoid bringing up any philosophers or any named prior knowledge coming to this text on evil, because one of the things that I think your work intimates to me is its own demand for a kind of innocence or vulnerability, but also that the tools that have been imparted to me by most of the philosophy that I focused on throughout my life is in some ways inadequate with respect to the unadulterated encounter with the kind of intensities that you try to evoke in your books. And that's something that I really appreciate about your writing. But part of the reason that I want to suspend my philosophical predilections is that, well, sometimes philosophy itself is evil and may even be included among or seen as an inheritor of some of the evil techniques that we may discuss today, which I think brings me to my first question. What compelled you to write a book on the techniques of evil? And given that we're a philosophy podcast, maybe you could comment about how this work differs from the metaphysical approaches familiar to various figures and schools in the history of philosophy that has taken evil as one of the objects of its study.
Absolutely. So the first thing, if you're looking at techniques, I always like to elevate the acute specificity of a concept. If you put evil before a space, all of a sudden it transforms the space. It casts a kind of enigmatic shadow that makes that space operate distinctly. So, I mean, for instance, the evil of the garden, the evil of the mountain, the evil of the desert. They're going to be wildly different things phenomenologically, sensorially, narratively, that emerge just from that coupling of the term evil with a particular spatial zone. If you did that with an object, and you imagine the evil of the box, the evil of a diamond, the evil of sort of a blade, and all of that, which you see in mythologies and storytelling throughout history. All of a sudden, you transfuse it with different potentials and intensities. So it makes it impossible then, if you take that approach, to speak of evil in some all-encompassing definition, which has been what philosophy and religion have attempted to do throughout history. Evil is X. Well, the evil of the experience of the ocean in Moby Dick, for instance, you know what I mean? The possibility of the shipwreck, of drowning, of being devoured alive by the white whale is not the same as the evil of someone. For instance, Michel Serres talks about when he had to escape a ship that was on fire and half his body was in flames as he was trying to go through a window, and he got stuck in one of the sort of the panes of glass, and half his body is in frozen temperatures outside and half is in sort of this inferno. And he describes it as unbearable and incomprehensible to have sort of the equator of his own physicality split into two extremes and all that. So these are wildly different sort of possibilities. And then there's the evils of the figures. Widows have been tied to evil throughout history. Albinos have been tied to evil throughout history. Kings, there are kings and queens who are evil. There are rebels who become evil. So there's all different typologies here. So just to say that right there already puts you in a matrix and a labyrinth that is so intricate and full of singularities, sort of in a sense, that you have to treat each one of them like its own kind of vital little music box that plays on its own. Never mind genres. So if you want to know, actually, I never gave the origin story to my interest on evil. It actually came through the prism of lullabies. I was looking at the genre of lullabies, and I adore lullabies because it's a lot of people don't know this, it's one of the most ancient genres of writing. So there's an ancient Babylonian lullaby that's from 2000 and something BC, where it says, "And who has angered the house god? The child has angered the house god. Come before me, says the house god." It's like this very threatening, ominous refrain that's warning of sort of offense and violation of dark forces and all that, and the possibility of wrath and punishment. It opens up all kinds of things. You have to wonder why the first civilizations on Earth would, one, have such sort of evil sort of tales, but then two, why they would mask them in these sing-song, seemingly innocent children's genres. And so that intrigued me. And the reason is I think lullabies are brutally honest. I think they're ruthlessly clear about our material condition in the world in the way that political ideologies, social discourses, religions are not. So lullabies are about pretending. Pretending to me is not metaphysical or transcendent the way that religion or politics or society are. If you watch children play, and I have a good chance of doing that all the time, I have a 2-year-old daughter, so I watch her play all the time. I play with her all the time. Play is about engagement with material conditions. You play in a space, whether it's the forest or the pool or the room, or the corner even, and you play with the things that you have at your disposal. Just like magic in its origins is actually, sorcery in its origins is all based on material combinations. You look at witches' brews, you look at cauldrons, they're not otherworldly substances. They're eyes of creatures, they're the skins of other creatures, they're certain herbs and toxic sort of botany properties. So for me, the lullaby actually confronts our mortality. It confronts death in the way that politics and religion differ and disavow, by providing sense of progress or destiny or a prime mover to the universe or an afterlife. The wonderful thing about children's games and lullabies is that they end and they know they're going to end. The whole point is that they end soon because it allows the possibility of return, but also of a new game. And that's something that societies have never gotten right. Despite the bloodiest revolutions, civilizations have not learned that lesson, which is that regimes should consider themselves games or forms of pretend. And if they did, then at least all of the ceremonies and rituals and spectacles we see in society would have a little bit of a dose of creativity and lightness to them, rather than the totalitarian severity that we see. So I started looking, just again to make the point, I started looking at the genre of lullabies, started going way back in time to seeing how the ancients structured them, and seeing sort of, they're really amazing ones, by the way. One figure in a lullaby this is a Sumerian one, wears your face and then goes around doing terrible things in your name and then ransoms your face back to you, but only if you do something terrible. So they implicate you, talking about evil, they implicate you sort of by necessity in this, they corner you. That's why it's a book about techniques. That's a technique of manipulation, right? It places you with no options but to surrender to the opponent's strategy. And by the way, just to say quickly, that's the book of Job too. That's what the devil does to God in the gamble. Says, hey, give me a shot at your creation over here and I'll mess with him, I'll disturb his life. And God falls for the bet. Doesn't matter if God wins the bet or not. The fact that he's wagering with evil means he's doused and drenched in evil, playing the game. But anyway, I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
No, I just wanted to say, like, there's also something about especially in the cadence of contemporary lullabies. We don't have to go back to 4,000 years necessarily, but the function of the lullaby is a very placid command, and I think I love what you write, where when you ask why is a lullaby evil, and you decide that you forego on the entire style of this book just for one moment, and you just go, because it is manipulative. And I think that the calming cradle of melodies, not just as a game of soothsaying, but of directing and of creating out of nascency a vessel for the continuation of evil is really a remarkable anecdote. But I also wanted to talk to you about what the relationship in this lullaby. You speak a little bit about the lullaby being futuristic rather than just in that moment, right? If we're singling out this technique of the lullaby, we think about it as a necessary intervention in the behavior of a child in this instance in order to create this outcome. Can you talk a little bit about why there's this futural part here?
Absolutely. Well, and I make this strange technological jump from an ancient genre to a futuristic destiny, because evil in almost every tradition that I've encountered is tied to intelligence. And so when we're entering an age of artificial intelligence and all of the paranoia surrounding the possibilities of this incomprehensible leap in sentience, in consciousness, in scale, right? Obviously, then we're talking about something that definitionally meets one of the criteria of evil. That evil has been linked to knowledge, has been linked to intelligence. If you even look at the fact that, I know that you all talk about societal issues a lot of the time as well, socio-political issues, and then you have me on to do the Wonderland strange things. But I'll talk about society for just a second and say something, which is that if you've ever noticed, for centuries, premeditated murder gets exponentially more severe punishment than manslaughter, which is killing someone in the heat of the moment, in a state of rage, in a state of super emotion. Now, this empirically makes no sense whatsoever, because a dead body is a dead body. To the corpse, it's the same outcome. To the family, it's the same outcome. And so why is there death penalty extended in many instances to someone who plans and plots a death, as opposed to someone who has an uncontrollable burst of anger or something like that? And the reason is because society punishes intelligence. It fears intelligence. It wants a society that is full of ignorant people, and that's the Garden of Eden. And so the serpent in the garden is not wrong to whisper in Eve's ear, and that's why I named my daughter Eve, by the way, to whisper in her ear that, what kind of God doesn't want you to know the secrets of the universe that you're in, And so to some extent, we're talking about that when we talk about technology and the unbound sort of thresholds that we are about to cross with it. By the way, when you just look as an academic, I say that somewhat shamefully, but as an academic, I can tell you that most people, when they do comparative research, they look at 1, 2, 3 examples, of something, whether they're looking at corruption in local politics around the world, or they're looking at climatological examples. They look at 2, 3. Can you imagine a force of analysis that can track everything in real time and also the entire history leading up to it? The things that AI will reveal about human behavior, human society, they're going to be deeply troubling to every paradigm and every assumption that we've based our house of cards of reality principles upon. We're not going to like what we see about ourselves when we're actually watched by a semi-omniscient gaze. This is why Nietzsche says the death of God happens. God has to die because you can't bear this ultimate witness who sees everything.
Can I interject with a question then about, you said earlier, and I think I just want to put a pin in it, where you say every evil I've encountered is tied to a notion of intelligence. And I was just joking with Craig. I was spamming him, Nietzsche and Jason. But we often represent AI as a black box. Of course, it's very helpful to the technicians and technocrats who are promoting this for personal reasons, for it to be seen as the obelisk in the movie, 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Yes.
And you're talking a lot about intelligence. And I'm wondering if maybe you can talk about the relationship between the representation of intelligence and information, and where you speak about the archive in Zone 7 of your book on evil.
So you're right. The whole third section of the book on evil is a library of evil with a catalog sort of various types. And I just couldn't help myself from trying to be the architect of a library of evil. It just sounded like such a great task. And, one of my favorite short stories of all time was Jorge Luis Borges' Library of Babel. And so it's such an amazing, elegant, universe that he constructs of people looking for the answer, the ultimate text, and what bizarre strategies and methods they come up with. That's why it fits into a book on techniques, because if you're in a library that's an infinity machine, how do you go left or right? And some people, they resort to throwing dice and they just use chance and luck, and some think that they develop a very sophisticated criterion of navigation, through, and they see clues. So when we're talking about information, it's a wonderful question, because to me, I just taught another seminar on madness, and this time around, it's a seminar that goes from mania, schizophrenia, hysteria, obsession, melancholia, and then we try to find new typologies of those that weren't covered in the psychoanalytic literature. But the one for me that this time around hit me as my absolute favorite, and it's the sort of the flavor that got me this time around, was paranoia. And you cannot find, you can call it a pathology or a state of mind, that is more about information collection than paranoia. Deeply paranoid subjects are looking at everything and archiving every modality, every appearance, every individual that passes them on the street, and almost instantaneously classifying them in the most complex ways. And this is interesting to me because actually there's a psychoanalytic literature on states of emergency. So how people behave, for instance, when a house is burning, right? And what intrigues me about that is that it's discovered that actually people make amazingly elaborate decisions as they're fleeing burning flames. So category 1 in your hierarchy are living things. You grab the baby, you grab the dog, right? Category 2, valuable things. You grab the diamonds, you grab the, whatever's the money and all of that. 3, sentimental things. You grab that necklace that your grandmother gave you. You grab something that is as a memento or is irreplaceable. 4, documents, things that are hard to go and get again, your driver's license, your wallet, your passport, things of that nature, right? So all of these, and on and on and on. Meanwhile, you are cross-dividing and cross-analyzing those complex categories with categories of portability. Can I carry it? So if the most, sort of valuable thing in your house is an antique table, good luck. It's going to go up, in flames. But also distance from the fire. So if that necklace of your grandmother is on the 3rd floor and you're on the 1st, it's also a lost cause. And you do this instantaneously. And so this is the interesting thing that Barsov found out. He's the psychoanalyst who looked at this, is that very few people regret what they didn't take from a burning fire. They seem to have made the correct decisions. And he says, this is not reason or rationality, which is plagued by doubt, plagued by misgivings, the fact that we even think shows that we have a kind of schizophrenic consciousness, all of us universally. Otherwise, who are you talking to? If you ever watch the way a cat moves through a house, It is the pure symmetry of thought, action, movement, sensation, desire. It knows exactly what it wants. It knows exactly how to synchronize its musculature to its awareness. There's no doubt. There's no guilt. There's no mommy daddy issues. There's no bad psychology, right? We are plagued by all these rifts and schisms, and we give ourselves credit and call that profundity. But in the state of emergency, you notice that it's the animal that wins. It's the animality in us that guides us, the instinctual level. So, and that's why, intriguingly, I'll just, without going off on a ledge, but just as a thing to that, if we look at who is the next step in evolutionary progress in our horror imagination, it's the vampire. Vampires are superior to us. They're smarter than us. They're more agile than us. They're more ferocious than us. They're more beautiful than us in many ways. They're mesmerizing, hypnotic, seductive creatures, but they're more powerful than we are at almost every register. And they're more animal than we are. Right? They obey the laws of their thirst. They synchronize everything through the fangs, right? And yet that allows them to read minds, to teleport, to levitate, to walk up walls, to invade your dreams, to manipulate you. So extreme intelligence and extreme animality or sensoriality are actually not mutually exclusive, the way that in our Enlightenment modernity, we're taught that we're only knowing subjects if we split ourselves. And so I've always said it's a kind of pitiful consequence of modernity that we can think something we would never say something we would never do something that we don't dare think about. I mean, that's wretched. It's an absolutely weak condition, and that's what, when Deleuze and Guattari talk about schizophrenia, that's actually what they're talking about. Antonin Artaud does not hesitate. There's no slack in his act. There's no split second of lapse in his game. When he wants something, he goes after it. What he thinks is what he says is what he does. That's what Badiou later would call the event, but he would never dare incarnate it in a human being. But all you have to do is watch videos of Artaud, and you see there is no separation between his mind, his body, his nerves, and the way he moves on the world. And so for me, that's actually one of the criterion of evil as well. Look at how stylish the devil is. Right? God is abstraction. God is vanished. God has no face, no body. The devil knows how to work every facet of the world of appearances and the world of thought and the world of language. Right? So there's the informational sort of dimension.
Yes, reminds me a lot of something we did a long time ago, which was go through our friend Vern Sisney's sort of lecture course on the history of Satan, aspects of freedom, and also an embodiment of really in both the gender sense and the general sense of man. And I wanted to ask, insofar as intelligence is always correlative to a certain technique of evil, I mean, one of the ways that human intelligence has tried to grapple with evil, and you deal with this a lot, particularly in the sequence that derives itself from mystical and theological literature on evil, and this is the idea of theodicy, the idea that humans have tried to explain evil either as a lack of good or as a dialectical contrary to good, but instead, in looking at it in terms of techniques, especially in terms of looking to literature as far back as possible as well, evil becomes something much more concerned with, I think, if I understand right, narrative. And it's a narratological technique, possibly even a technique of intelligence trying to explain its own capacity and its own failures to itself in this schizophrenic kind of mode. So I guess I got to ask her, and I'm going to break Craig's rule and mention one philosopher, which is Bataille, of course, because he wrote, Literature and Evil. And in a sense, his argument that literature gives us a kind of complicity in the knowledge of evil, because all literature is manipulating us to think of, to bear witness to things of evil or a possibility of evil. How does, I guess, literature and narrative feed into evil? And indeed, to understand techniques of evil, how does that amount to the knowledge of evil? And does this implicate us in evil in the sense of knowledge's inherent disposition towards it?
It's an excellent question, and so I don't mind saying this just because there's that old line that bad artists plagiarize and great artists steal, right? So I don't mind confessing my influences and my adoration for certain figures. Nietzsche obviously is the is the prime one for me, has always been for instance, a young age. But Bataille is probably my second favorite philosopher ever to walk the earth. And just absolutely stunning writer, one of the most elegant thinkers that one could ever encounter, and an impassioned, intense sculptor of words. To his fragments are like no one else's. So I adore these figures for sure, among many others. The only thing that I would say, this is an interesting one for me. Why is it that, I don't want to start a territory fight here, but why is it that Deleuze and Guattari, but particularly Deleuze, has almost no interest in George Bataille's work? Now he cites almost everyone under the sun, right? And they run in the same crowds and circles, even though Bataille is one generation before him, right? They're bridged by, their mutual friendships with figures like Foucault, their knowledge of Lacan and all that stuff, and their adoration of Nietzsche. They both claim to be kind of right in the house of Nietzsche. So this is a strange omission that Deleuze almost never talks about Bataille. Some would accuse it of the fact that Deleuze didn't like the concept of death. He thought it had become overly abused, in the history of philosophy, even since Socrates saying that it's an art of learning to die well. He thought death was a cliche at that point. Maybe Bataille was too death obsessed for him. That's one theory. But I think the actual reason is, and it makes sense at some level, and this is maybe the only place that I would, as much as I have immense respect for Deleuze as a thinker, but this may be the only place that I would side with him over Bataille, is that he thinks Bataille is still caught in the awe for transgression, and that he loves the idea of this forbidden border that, if you cross it, it's just saturated with all of this rich metaphysics and damnation and punishment and the fall from ecstasy and all of that, which to him is too religious perhaps, and just also too dialectical. And, so if you look at the fact that Deleuze loves Kafka, now Kafka, I would say, is a writer of evil. I would definitely say Kafka is I wouldn't say he's a writer. I'd say he's an evil writer. If you look at the way he manipulates, and his techniques and all of that, the way he strands the reader in ambiguity, in worlds that don't make sense. I mean, it's a plague to read The Castle. It's a plague to read The Trial. It's nothing but restlessness and questions. It's a book of questions and obscurity. But what Deleuze loves about figures like that, he also loves Melville, who writes Moby Dick, which is a figure of evil, and all of that, in many ways that I mentioned earlier. So what's the reason is that Deleuze likes amoral characters, not immoral ones. And for me, that's also why the lullaby is an interesting one. That's why when you mentioned Satan, one of the things that I hold against the monotheistic tradition, for all of its beauty and horror, from the Inquisitions to, Michelangelo's sculptures, you can run the, back and forth on a pendulum that swings from the most wondrous to the most awful. And actually it's interesting. I always say this, the etymology, if you look at the word awesome and awful, they both are composed of awe. It's just some awe is really good and full of awe is really bad. So religion can kind of do both historically. But one of the things I don't like that it does, monotheism, is that it steals so much good material and content from paganism and from the things that came before it. And it doesn't admit that it's done that. And then it simplifies and reduces it in order to make it more universal. Like anything you do, if you want a movie that is a blockbuster, you have to work at kind of the most basic emotions. If you want a pop song, you have to simplify melodies. So I think religion does that with Satan. As interesting a figure as Satan is, and you can read Paradise Lost, and there's wondrous possibilities within there. But Satan comes from the Egyptian god Set. And Set is much more intriguing to me in some ways, because Set, he's the god of the desert, storms, foreigners, and the color red. Already an amazing conceptual combination there. But Set is not considered by the Egyptians an evil god in the monotheistic sense of being pure evil. He is a trickster god. He's a volatile god. He's a mercurial god. He's a moody god who half the time helps you and half the time kills you. And it just depends on what night you meet Set. And Caribbean traditions have figures like that with Papa Legba and others and all that, where they can help you out. He helps gamblers who are down on their luck. but then sometimes he steals their money afterwards. So it's a kind of cutthroat God a whimsical God, a temperamental God, which actually is kind of the God of the Old Testament. That's what they inherit from paganism, a God who's envious and can be wrathful and all of that stuff. But the last thing that I would just say so Set is amoral. He's not immoral. He's not good or evil per se. He's an amalgamation of potentials, and it just depends how you unlock them or how you play into them. And that's a really interesting thing that you don't see in monotheism. It matters how you approach Set. It matters how you speak to Set, meaning the outcome is contingent upon your gamesmanship at some levels. So it's not just the enslaved follower of monotheism who has these 10 commandments that they must observe, even though they don't understand them necessarily, or perform certain rituals, ablutions, prayers, ceremonies, and all of that, pure submission to the one. Instead, this is, and I don't know if any of you have ever had people in your lives who are psychologically temperamental, or manic even, right? Oh, it's always a minefield. You step into the room and it's a very delicate tightrope to know what to say, how to orchestrate and orient, how to get out of a situation when you offend and you don't realize what a trigger could be. So it's just endless provocations. You can win the game, but the odds are stacked that you're going to hit some turbulence along the way. And those are the gods that I find intriguing. And those are the gods who got scapegoated as evil later, just very complicated ones that demanded that you refine a methodology of how to play. And by the way, in East Asian, just to say this quickly, in East Asian mysticism, if you look at Taoism, you look at Buddhism, the question of how you move within the universe, right, is a universe that can, and they were very aware of this, can equally destroy you as it does, redeem you. What moves you make matter there. That's why monks are so, Buddhist monks, for instance, are so consumed by motion, by rhythm, by the way they step, by, all these different sort of ways of doing things, because they know it matters. It's not just some transcendent, omniscient being who makes the decision. It's you've got to play your hand too. You can't cheat your turn. So at any rate, just a quick answer, or not so quick answer.
No, I mean, also just on the point of actually, it's weird I've never actually thought about the fact that we've been doing Bataille and D&G for so long, and yet, they've never actually had a confluence. I think it's partially, I wonder if it's because Bataille somewhat presupposes Hegel, I think, and maybe there's too much of a stain there, or there's too much of a lack base there. But even for him, this evil force, the absence of myth is itself the myth that motivates everything. And I wonder in that extent, just go back to something you said before about how animality and God can be united in the figure of evil. Does this also work in the sense of a transgression? Does evil have to move through humans? Is it sort of an animality that moves through humans in order to have a divine character? Because for Bataille,
great question. Well, look at before Bataille was interested in tribal associations, but and he did his own anthropological work in really fascinating ways here and there. But if you look at the first gods, they are hybrid combinations of human and animal. And I trust the instincts of those first civilizations only because they were in survival mode. Their extreme vulnerability before the elements, they froze to death, they starved to death, they suffered famines, they suffered, common colds would wipe out entire tribes. They had to be on edge, vigilant like no one else, and they couldn't afford to do what we can do in our air-conditioned mall culture of today. They couldn't lie to themselves about where they were. They couldn't pretend they were in a utopia while the whole world is on fire, and going towards a dystopia. They had to face their finitude, their mortality, their desperation, their helplessness, the fact that they were freezing cold and scorching, heat, the fact that predatory animals were around every corner. And so the fact that they saw their gods as these ruthless amalgamations, that's the Sphinx, that's the centaur, that's the minotaur. It's there even before those first civilizations. It's there in the cave paintings and the hieroglyphs. The gods are these 1/3 alien, 1/3 beast, 1/3 human, which means that they're seen as the perfect, again, sort of synchronization of all the powers of each category, which I think is, again, where we're headed right now. Interestingly, in what you're asking, I mean, when we talk about the machine-human interface, it's not just machine of what we think of machine. That machine also contains ghostliness. It contains all kinds of other forms of being. But I did forget, I did a dishonor to you, my friend. You asked about storytelling real quick, and there's an interesting figure just when you're talking about evil and stories. And you just think about the rich histories of folklore, from all parts of the world, from Eastern Europe to Latin America to East Asia to Mongolian folklores about demons and witches and all these sorts of things, and how evil just lends itself to storytelling in the most amazing ways that the good doesn't. Like, stories about good people tend to be very, very boring and archetypal, and they become kind of lessons, moral lessons. But there's a figure, since we're naming wonderful dead philosophers and trying to honor them, there's also a figure who kind of played in the playground with figures like Bataille, and that's Walter Benjamin. But he comes from a different angle altogether. Benjamin kind of, an obvious on the surface Marxist, but intrigued by mysticism, hid that from his Marxist colleagues, that he was deeply intrigued by mysticism. And actually, I don't know if you all know this, how it is that Benjamin, Bataille, and Jacques Lacan all know one another. But, they're not that they're hanging out in France. It's that they used to attend secret sessions on mysticism taught by Alexander Kojève, the great Hegelian. So in a time when mystical thought was considered, Sartre had no patience for it, and he kind of ran and dominated the throne of French intellectual circles. Surrealists under Breton hated it for a number of reasons. So there were a lot of figures who were banishing it as sort of this irrational. Freud hated mysticism and almost disowned Jung, partially because of his interest in some of those things or misunderstandings of what that meant. So there were these secret gatherings where Benjamin, Lacan, and Bataille used to go to Alexander Kojève's house and listen to him talk about and lecture on mysticism and discuss it together. And that's why Benjamin famously gave his last manuscripts to Bataille to hide in the floorboards of the National Library in Paris, where he worked. But it's Benjamin who figures something out there, that the responsibility of ancient storytellers, and I've said this in other places, sorry for anyone who's hearing it repeated, it's Benjamin's theory is that the storyteller exists in order to confront the child with death. It's to teach death, because no parent, I look at myself, again, father of a 2-year-old, there's absolutely no impulse in me that wants to teach my daughter that I'm going to die on her one day. And then even worse and unbearable for me, that she will die one day, right? So this is an awful lesson. And so you need a third neutral party to come in. And the way that the storyteller instructs and mediates this encounter with death is by telling a story that has a beginning, middle, and end, and acquaints them with the fact that things end, that phenomena end, that we are in an impermanent world, and that not only do things cease and perish, but that they're irreversible when they do. You can't go back. You can go back and read the story, but the outcome is the same. Your favorite character dies. You can't reclaim them or recover them. That's a way of instructing them in the experience of loss and mortality that's going to hit them soon enough, right? So that's where I think the storyteller has always been linked to fear and to evil as well, if death is part of the game of evil.
I want to ask you, Jason, what inspired you to organize this book the way that you did? What inspired you to begin the book on evil with a set of principles and then move on to diagrams and then to talk about libraries? Because I see that there might be an implicit evil even in doing that, in the sense that to create a set of principles is almost to create a canon, which in some sense delimits activity, delimits insights, if you will. Diagrams, a series of typologies, libraries, archives. Here's the knowledge of importance. And of course, there's an outside. There are things that are excluded from that. And I've been thinking a lot lately about the ways in which our archives, the Western canon, our favorite philosophers, those who I'm not talking about here today, often become these kind of anchors or stables, whatever metaphor we want to use, that keep us sort of locked in a kind of inactivity or suppress our thinking and creativity. And I don't know if that's implicit in the organization itself, but something like that does seem to be taking place here. So I was hoping that maybe you could speak to the organization, and then if there are any attendant insights on how maybe philosophy itself or the archive itself might be evil, if you could talk about that.
Absolutely. So let's start with, so as you nicely, and I appreciate all of you reading through this strange treatise and all three parts of it. If we start with notations, those notations are not meant to be absolute precepts. They're meant to be almost like in martial arts, forms that can be deployed. Now, if you look closely, a lot of them seemingly contradict themselves. Meaning, I say something like evil can practice in extreme speed, can accelerate reality. Then I'll say evil can practice in extreme slowness. It can paralyze reality. And you can think of images that come to that. You can think of sort of evil that is, again, instantaneous almost, but you can also think of like a gargoyle, which is frozen in time, sort of, and all that. So I'll say things that I use paradox and contradiction because I don't want to, they're not delimiting sort of a finite map. Instead, they're saying these are like cards in a deck that can be played given the circumstance. They're highly contingent upon circumstance. Which typology of evil is the right one to summon at any given moment depends on whether you're in a dead end, in an alleyway, in a labyrinth, on a cliff about to fall. It depends, sort of, and all that. So that's the first thing that I would say. That's why there are just so many of them too, and they could proliferate. It's just you have to call it quits somewhere eventually. As for diagrams, this is the attempted humility on my part of switching modes because of the realization that my thoughts will change if I change the sort of the matrix of how I'm engaging. I always took it very seriously that one thing I'm writing now. So here's something that, for instance, I'm writing now a short piece for another book on weather events in literature. So imagine entire civilizations or entire tribes or entire secret societies that define themselves through some climatological phenomenon that happened, an earthquake, a flood, sandstorms in the desert, right? That their identity is predicated upon a climatological weather occurrence, right? Hurricane seasons, things like that. So similarly, I know that, okay, it's if I listen to the elder Nietzsche, I should realize that probably my thoughts will morph slightly when it's raining outside. That rain should have and it should have an effect. If not, I'm a terrible philosopher. Then I'm in a vacuum, I'm in a bubble, pretending that I'm doing high stakes work, but allowing anything to challenge or affect me whatsoever. Right? Remember all this stuff we call it affect now that comes from Deleuze, actually, most of it, which is a stunning revolution in thought. It just means being affected. Right? Just allowing yourself to be affected by things that are occurring. So I allowed myself to be affected by saying, okay, now I'm not going to write in textual notations. I'm going to write in diagrams. And I'm going to reset to zero and play the game again, but this time in diagrammatic fashion. And diagrams unleash just a different type of thinking about the topic, as well as then moving into a much more speculative side of things, of inventing books that have never been written before, or to my knowledge, at least, have not been written before. And I really hope that some people steal some good dissertation topics from that, or book topics for themselves in the future. Because I worked hard to come up with weird literatures that I don't think exist until this point. And so that was sort of me plunging into sort of the third component. And that just allows you to write differently, different tonalities. Even the fact that some are written in shorter sentences. When you write in diagrams, you have one word, essentially for every, it's like, I think I have eight chambers or 8 compartments. I'm only allowed one word, and then I have to let the reader fill in the blanks, of why that word is associated in that particular constellation. So I like that, but I'll just say one other thing to the diagram, because I've been talking about this recently. I'm really fascinated by a concept I rediscovered recently. So something that I had read 20 years ago, lost track of it completely, and then it visited me again. I didn't find it by my own will. There's a great diagnosis by one of Freud's rivals, actually Freud's ultimate rival, Emil Kraepelin, great German psychiatrist. I don't adore everything he said, just in the same that Freud doesn't. He's a genius, but I'm not always on his side with everything. But Kraepelin says something really cool. He says, this Freudian symptomatological method is so constrictive because, and it's a false method at some levels, to go after symptoms, individual symptoms, and say, well, schizophrenics do this. He says, actually, if you notice, almost any symptom that you say, identify or isolate that can happen in one type of madness can also happen in every other type of madness. They're much more fluid and interchangeable. You can have delusions of grandeur in manic depression. You can have delusions of grandeur in schizophrenia. You can have delusions of grandeur in hysteria. You can have all these kinds of things. What he says matters is the syndrome, which is to say the particular sequence, pattern, configuration of symptoms, right? That creates sort of this elegant mapping that allows you to identify something. And so I like that idea, because then you could actually go and redesign every one of those diagrams. And they would change by taking a single term and placing them. And that doesn't offend me, because I'm not selling, a moral philosophy on evil. Instead, I'm inventing a card game, and I would love others to come and say, what if we played with this strategy? Just like chess evolves new moves all the time, new forms of attack, new forms of defense. This should do the same, as well as even new rule sets. It doesn't bother me if someone came and offered entirely different rule sets to this. It's just setting almost a point of departure for that. But the other thing I just wanted to mention then quickly to that is Emil Kraepelin, this psychoanalyst, he says something very cool as well. He has the idea that came back to me after 20 years was called confabulatory paraphrenia. Now, I had heard about that decades before, where he said, this gets too often associated with schizophrenia, and it's not. Confabulatory paraphrenia is basically people who invent very lavish, vivid, false memories of their life and tell them constantly to others, like that I'm actually the long-lost descendant of a royal dynasty, or that I have a lineage with werewolves, or that I'm actually the one who wrote George Bataille's books, and things like that. And they have sensorial memories of these things. They're absolutely convinced that they've lived these lives, and they have the most elegant, complex forms of storytelling. And what he noticed was schizophrenia tends to suffer from what's called a deterioration of identity over time. So it becomes worse and worse, more aggressive, more troubled, more tormented, more painful, the more that it goes through the motions of its delusions. But this one, confabulatory paraphrenia, became more ecstatic over time. And actually, the identity just became more multifarious, more multidimensional, more detailed, because it was always improvising like a writer, or a theatrical modality, always improvising. Which is why, by the way, Antonin Artaud should not be called schizophrenic. He should be in this designation, because Artaud just kept adding nuances, adding stories about his life to create this gigantic colossus figure called, Artaud. But what's amazing there is that Kraepelin in the end calls this euphoric dementia, which is a really cool line. And then it got me to thinking that, well, then what's the secret of euphoria? Because dementia we almost never describe as euphoric. We never picture it or envision it as a euphoric thing. We think of it as a terrible condition. So I started looking into it and realizing something. If you take paranoia again, which evil has been associated with, because paranoia is an ultimate form of intelligence, of looking and seeing everything and thinking about everything too much in excess. When does paranoia go bad? There is euphoric paranoia, and there's really sort of tortured paranoia. And what's the difference? Tortured paranoia is where I think everybody is out to get me, and everything I see in reality confirms my suspicion, my story. right? And that's the conspiracy theorists online, which is why they're tormented and why they often end in violence, the way that we're seeing today, right? But on the other side, if it remains partial, if it's not everyone is my enemy trying to kill me, if it's there's one person, Don Quixote calls him the enchanter in the story. He has one enemy, the enchanter, and that he only shows up in certain phenomena as cats or in mirrors. You follow? So it's only partial slivers of reality that are corroded or corrupted, or that keeps you in a euphoric game then. You have moves to make, right? You're not in this fatalistic, deterministic, awful state of infestation, sort of, right? The syndrome remains an arena, or a game where I can beat this enemy. I can beat the enchanter, right? I just have to avoid mirrors, or I just have to align with forces that are against the enchanter, like stones, for instance. So this is where it remains euphoric. Even paranoia can be euphoric as long as you don't let it saturate the totality of reality and thereby become totalizing, which is what we call society, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, honestly, the method of paranoia precisely in that mode is more or less what characterized like our book. And I think like the solo book I wrote as a sequel, exactly like this. I mean, it is paranoia as a mode of thought to try and find points of capture and escape. And I really appreciate the way in which evil is presented here as a set of techniques, because it also takes me back to one of, every occultist's favorite factoid, which is the link between grammar and grimoire. And it really does seem that there's something of a grammatical work here, and especially in the idea of publishing it, giving general rules for application, and also sort of making it public. There's something evil about publication, and hell, if we know anything, the publishing industry is only getting more evil. So but I always sort of
don't give them the honor of such an exalted term. They're just bad. They're just bad.
Yeah, no, you know what? Let's be more stringently Nietzschean about this. But I also want to ask a question as well: is how this idea of evil, which is sort of being laid bare in terms of the rules of the game, which evil becomes published, it becomes techniques, it becomes something manipulable, becomes not a technique but also a techniques. How that might relate to your other work recently on secret societies, where here evil is being moved from the esoteric to the exoteric. Here, where this relate to the movement to the esoteric, the enclosure of things.
Thanks for the segue there. No doubt there's a link, and actually there were written a lot of, the Secret Societies book is underway, but a lot of things were written simultaneously in this regard, because what I was trying to do there, and it's a similar game in some ways, and the name of the Secret Societies book is The Unlost. And the reason is because I was looking after, and I've done this for decades in my own life. It's just I never thought to actually write about the process of doing it, is to look for and to unearth books of secret societies that have been lost in time. So these are forbidden books. These are books that have been hidden, misplaced, neglected, they either because they were too obscure in their meanings, or like you said, too esoteric in the topic. So there's medieval notebooks on blood purification, completely superstitious stuff, but you can only find it in one library in a small village in Spain, for instance, right? There are journals of caravan thieves from the Arab world that nobody takes as legitimate knowledge. Who would ever want to read? To even read it means that you're captivated by thieves, and who wants to read the diaries of thieves unless you're planning something? And so they're typically in ill taste, even though they exist and are somewhat accessible. Or they're books that are famed books of legend that were part of libraries that have burned to the ground in history. And that's a tragic undercurrent of the history of philosophy and literature and theology and all of knowledge, that we have these burned libraries like the House of Wisdom in Baghdad or Alexandria in Egypt. And it's a hell of a thing to think how frail the practice is. These are entire lives devoted to subject matters, to inquests, tracing things only for some idiot emperor or something like that, or some thuggish, militaristic force to decide to set fire to something. So it's a way of trying to also just remember that we're always beneath the knife of history in that regard. But what's similar in a certain regard is that the method for a book on secret societies and lost books is like a book on evil. You're chasing rumors a lot of the time. Everything's kind of hearsay, half lies. I love the fact that when I go to places like parts of North Africa to look for some of these lost books, I used to do that a lot more in past years. Everything is exaggerated, distorted. They're fabricated clues. You can't really trust. The booksellers are testing you. The booksellers are passing on things that have been echoed 5 times, through street corners and all of that. And they're intentionally misleading you, or they don't know they're misleading you. And so a really intriguing challenge right away when you're in this ocean of deceptive signs and imposter suspicions is that you either choose the route of knowledge or aesthetics, meaning when you have no absolute criterion of knowing if something is true or not about a secret society that once existed there or might still exist there. How do you discern between this avalanche of things being told to you, which one to follow? If you go the route of knowledge, you go an epistemological route, then you become the ultimate detective. You almost do like forensic kind of breakdown, laser sort of techniques of trying to differentiate which is more credible, which is more authentic, based on the reputation of the person who's telling you, based on the context, based on how close they were as an eyewitness or something like that. Actually, a lot of things which have now become part of just the law today. You can apply those. And that hopefully will get you closer to the inner circles of the mystery that you're looking to go to. But I actually like the second route. And weirdly enough, paradoxically, it often led me closer to what you might call the truth, which is just chasing your favorite story. So you're told 3 different things by 3 different people. Just go with the one that sounds the coolest to you. And I learned this method from, by the way, this is even, I'm not that far from a history department where I'm sitting right now. They would come and burn me at the stake for saying this, but I know their dirty secret, which is that's how Herodotus starts the discipline of history. He says something like, there are like 8 stories circulating about how Cyrus the Great became the king of Persia. I'm going to tell you my favorite one. That's his methodology. Is just this whimsical mood choice of I like this one the best. So I learned this actually not from Herodotus, I learned it from Sufi mystics. Because Sufi mystics, when they go back and some mystic was sanctified, it's almost always after their death, right? That they become this kind of saint. Everybody starts generating accounts of miracles, right? And it's really cool how contagiously people enjoy being like, well, I once saw him do this and I once saw her do that, and all that. And and so the question of how do Sufis then, how do Islamic mystics historically, what do they include and what do they throw out? They include the best stuff. So for instance, Hallaj, who was this amazing early mystic who was crucified for claiming that he was God, and he supposedly danced in ecstasy in his chains as he was being led to the cross to be burned on the cross. And while he was burning, he screamed out in ecstasy, I am God, I am God. And it left this haunting resonance in people's minds in the Middle East throughout history. There's a story about him that he was talking very calmly and serenely with a crowd of people in a room at night. And there was this candlelight flickering in a lantern. And all of a sudden they noticed as he was speaking that his shadow began stretching to like overwhelming monstrous proportions on the wall behind him. Sufis include that reminiscence. They include that account in everything written about Hallaj, just because it's awesome. It's just a great phenomenological account and it's unique. It's something they hadn't heard before. So that's why they throw it in there. Whether it's more or less true, that's almost irrelevant. So in some ways, that's what you have to do, especially when you're dealing with secret societies. We have to remember that the really good ones, the ones that I consider the elite ones, they turn themselves into walking riddles, meaning they purposefully circulated misinformation about themselves, misunderstandings about their origins, their beliefs, their rituals. So they wanted to be concealed in some ways or misread in other ways. And so even what's out there on the surface in the light of day, you can't trust that the architects of that information weren't people trying to throw you off course.
Jason, Speaking of stretching shadows, I'm sure you have been approached about the film Nosferatu, the most recent remake. And I've actually been reading a few different things as of late. I'm reading this collection of essays by the famous archetypal psychologist James Hillman on melancholy and mania. And it made me think of you and your work on mania. And looking at the film Nosferatu, I mean, melancholy is not only an operative theme, but it is a very stark thematic choice made by Eggers to convey the story of the kind of yearning and transfiguration that the character of Ellen is undergoing. And I'm curious if you've seen the film and if you have a take on it, and we'll just say spoiler alert at this point if you're listening.
I'm going to disappoint everyone here that I haven't seen it. Against every desire and instinct, my lovely child, who's my universe, my whole universe, she keeps me very closely bound to the realm of cartoons most of the time, and so I haven't had a chance to steal a night for myself. But it's going to be a luxury item in the next couple of weeks where I do my escape artist move, get out of the house late at night, and under the cloak of night, be able to watch this. I have seen some of the imagery, though. I did see the silhouette behind a curtain, which was a really powerful sort of cinematography. And what intrigued me was the look of the actress while being sort of the shadow of the claw, I think, was on her face in that scene. That's the only thing I know of it. And I just recently talked about the fact that, you know, a friend of mine, Eugene Thacker, who you guys may know of, you know, he's a friend of mine who I don't see for years at a time, but he's a wonderful thinker in so many regards. But he wrote a piece many years ago about this turn towards what he called it transcendent horror, where he said, you know, in the 80s when I was a kid growing up, you had the Freddy Krueger, Jason from Friday the 13th. You had evil embodied in a particular fiend or monster, and your job was simply to outrun it or kill it by the end of the film, right? So it was a pure exteriority, something totally unlike you and foreign to you that was chasing you, that was trying to harm you, and you could either, dodge it or annihilate it. And then you look at films like The Witch, you look at The Lighthouse, you look at Midsummer, and they all end with this look of rapture at the end of the surrender of the human to the evil universe. So it's not a person anymore. It's not a circumscribed, you know, monster figure necessarily. It's that the universe is evil. The whole universe is evil, and that they realize this finally, and they become one with the evil. And that's why there's this look of kind of sort of happy resignation on all their faces at the end of the film. I didn't see that in the Nosferatu. Instead, I saw a more ancient principle, which was just complete frozenness, like disbelief, the incomprehensible, which I like at first glance. What bothers me, and I love that Eugene Thacker mentioned this move towards transcendent horror as a new philosophical orientation of our generation towards horror, which may be more interesting than the old creature sort of typology. But I do worry that it's actually complicit with, and I don't want to sound like a critic here, I'm complicit that whole smile at the end is actually part of the narcissistic capitalist era of everything is about me and everything is for me, and I'm the center of the universe again, and I can customize my, you know, evil to my own individual, you know, consumption. And for me, it's more interesting when evil is pure exteriority, you know, when it remains purely outside as something that is exceptionally alien and strange. I think that's more powerful. And so I'm a little bit concerned with that move. So whether Nosferatu then, whether you can, you know, become the creature or not, or whether the creature is a standout and it does not represent all of being. You know, in the old ones, like the Bela Lugosi vampire ones, the castle stands out on the horizon as a perversion or an anomaly against the sky, against the village, against the forest. You know what I mean? It seems to be almost like an alien hovercraft. It shouldn't be there. It's what's not supposed to have happened, right? And so, and the creature by extension is the same. You know, even in Dr. Frankenstein, it's an unintended consequence, right? And I love the fact, by the way, just to bring back to earlier discussion, a lot of people always forget that that Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's masterpiece, is a book about technology as well. It's a book about the invention of electricity and her fear that this supposedly utopian invention was going to lead to catastrophic monstrosity and destruction, which is the same debate we're having now, again, with artificial intelligence. It's the electricity of our time, you know, in a way. But no, I haven't seen the film. I promise you, if you have me back at a later round, I'll watch it.
I do, though, want to jump on your comment about being drawn into children's animation, because our discussion started with the lullaby, and in sequence 1 of this book on evil, you talk about immemorial collapse, and yet, you know, the aperture and the function of sort of being drawn in. If the lullaby is evil, I'm thinking, or if the lullaby is a technique of evil, I'm wondering, what do you make of the proliferation of strange cartoons across the internet that are meant to render children docile, right? These, I mean, I'm assuming you've seen these increasingly bizarre cartoons, and I'm wondering if you can maybe connect these two things.
It's a great question. I'll give a negative and a positive, because you know, I never trust that something, you know, I kind of had this dualism. It could turn bad, it could turn great. It could be an opening, it could be a closure that looks like an opening. So, for instance, our generation is seemingly the most vulgar in terms of, if you look at just, I mean, swearing and cursing and profanity on TV and movies, but even in the everyday, you'll see young kids swear around old people in ways that, let's say, older cultural moments would have prohibited, right? Now, at some levels, that seems liberating, maybe, that we're getting out of ageist hierarchies. Okay, the anarchistic side of me will grant that. But at the other level, I fear something that Artaud, who I mentioned earlier, feared. Artaud was filthy sometimes in his writing, right? Really could curse with the best, but he was an elite professional cursor. And they say that if he heard someone in a cafe in Paris swear in front of him, he would get up and leave. He would storm out, because he would be offended by the amateurism. But what he was also disturbed by was the mediocritization of the most extreme language. So, like the F word is supposed to conjure damnation itself. It's supposed to bring the heavens like collapsing overhead on the person you say it to. And I hear kids these days just drop it like a placeholder, like it's like, or, you know, it doesn't qualify anything. It doesn't actually even intensify or electrify language the way that it's supposed to. So what's the outcome of that psychologically or existentially? People who, when they go to watch Nosferatu, write on Twitter, OMG, that was the most awesomely amazing, crazy movie I've ever seen. 5 exclamation points, all capital letters, 3 emojis. That means they're hitting this steroidal juice, sort of, because language isn't doing what language is supposed to be doing anymore. It doesn't have the voltage or the charge. So they've got to be hyperbolic and redundant and use every trick in the book. Just see, nothing should be amazingly, awesomely, whatever. Awesome already encompasses amazing.
I have to interject, and I think there are going to be a lot of listeners who are going to just be really upset or really going to laugh at what I'm about to say, but there's an entire brand of like children's YouTube content. I'm about to say Skibbity Toilet. You don't have to know what it is. I don't really know what it is, but it's these extraordinarily graphic and intense and uncanny and violent images that have, to say no meaning would be to give it too much credit, actually. what we're seeing is the proliferation. I think what you're describing is something like an empty intensity that is just absolutely empty. And I'm wondering if, just like how Hildegard von Bingen, the mystic of the mystic of the Shivias wrote that, aridity, emptiness is precisely that space where evil can start to, it's aridity that through which evil can start to sort of manifest. I'm wondering if the increasing intensity yet emptiness of cartoons in our age opens up sort of new techniques of evil.
I hope so, but I would say it would have to be through active nihilism, not passive nihilism. So active nihilism is that I can get my little 2-year-old daughter to play any game in the house, hide and seek, tag. I can get her to play any type of game, tug of war, which is an ancient Babylonian game, and all that. We play all sorts of games, and she's always up for it. But I've seen teenage members of my family who you cannot motivate to want to do anything. You could tell them that there are miracles happening in a hallway down the hall, and they're on their phone in that neurotic scroll mode, right? Which is full of supposed shock value. That's what it is. It's novelty. It's like, oh, what's this next thing? Oh, what's this next thing? But it's such a low intensity charge, as you said. And it's there just to create not awe or pleasure, but addiction, essentially. Anytime you see an addictive propensity, don't trust it then. And this is, who teaches me that? Great junkie writers throughout history. Like William Burroughs will tell you that. Burroughs will say the most boring person on earth is a junkie. For all the exoticism that we give to, as one himself, who writes the famous book, called that, for all the exoticism and adventure we think that's involved. And I have looked at literature of addicts, and I'm interested in decadent writers, the absinthe taverns. I've written a whole piece on opium dens and things like that. But more often than not, he said a junkie can usually only talk about one thing, junk. They only want to think about one thing or discuss one thing or discuss stories of one thing, which is the last time they were on the substance, And so it becomes actually very one-dimensional and confining. So even with shock, so think about that, like the jolt of a high, of a drug high, is kind of like a shock value. But when it becomes so repetitive and you're chasing the dragon and it's just diminishing returns, and now that thing in the veins is not working, and every time around it's getting less and less. And you even, here's one of the only times you will ever hear me give an homage to the great Socrates. But Socrates said one of the fundamental confusions of human beings is not being able to differentiate pleasure from release from pain. So every time my phone dings with a new text message, and I think it's a curiosity. Oh, who is that? That's not pleasure. That's release from pain. That's an anxiety mechanism, right? That's compulsive. And so I worry about this new methodology of really transgressive, really shocking. Comedy's even gone that way. Have you noticed that? You have stand-up comedians who are just foul and filthy beyond belief, who are not just willing, but who dive headlong into the most taboo subjects, who make jokes about AIDS, who make jokes about rape, who make jokes about, all kinds of different violence, murder, and all of that. And they're mainstream, by the way. These are extremely mainstream, many of them women, right? And all that as well. And I watch it and I see this is an interesting twist in the history of humor and comedy. But the problem is that the reason why they're allowed to get away with it is that there's this little wink sort of supremacy complex of the righteous who are saying the reason I can make this racist, sexist, violent joke is because I don't actually think that way. And the crowd uses, and so they exonerate themselves in this morality play. Like the fact that we laugh shows that we're above this vulgarized mode of thinking of others, that we're not the racist. So you get both a charge of self-righteous sort of sickly pleasure, along with actually getting to laugh at a racist or sexist joke, but pretend you're not laughing at it.
This actually really does open up, I think, something, even if we stumbled upon it accidentally, something rather profound about the unfunny humor of like contemporary comedy and the comedy scene, especially in like Austin with like Joe Rogan and all of those people, is we're told to laugh at the humor. It's not even particularly funny, right? There's an emptiness to it, and yet the laughing signifies that disconnect, and yet we're already supposed to be. So like, I think that in a certain sense, it goes back to that low level intensity issue here as well. But I'll finally let.
So then the question, when you say then, is there a space for evil? Evil would have to restore, not just disperse intensity, but restore the possibility for intensity, which is to say, to create the stage. Remember that you guys got me on this German French thing today, so let's do it. Heidegger in his piece called "What Are the Poets For?" says something really sly. He says that it's not about God, it's about the house of God being empty. There's no altar for God to inhabit. There's no dwelling, really. The dwelling has to come first. And so for him, poets lead you across this abyss and try to rebuild the house of God. It's really theological in certain ways and messianic. And that's what's not my favorite element of it. But I think this is the interesting issue, is that there used to be unknown spaces. There used to be undergrounds, fugitive spaces, pirate utopias, hideaways. That was the space of conspiracy before. Now, we really don't have much terra incognita. In an age of surveillance, in an age of hyper exposure of everything onto the internet, it's not simply that we don't have even a lot of physical spaces where you can go. And when I was a kid, there were forests I could get lost in. Now they're all building developments in those same forests and all of that. It's not only the actual physical space that's deteriorated, it's the inclination to find that physical space. Remember, we're talking about kids, every fairy tale is basically a story of a runaway, right? They're all abandoning reality, but there has to be an alternative space, whether it's the rabbit hole, or it's the wardrobe in Narnia, or it's the labyrinth in Pan's Labyrinth, or the forest in a million fairy tales and all that. There have to be portals. There have to be archways or gateways that allow this traversal from this awful reality principle. And I think it's the most wonderful and accurate indictment of the horror of adult human civilization, that every kid would rather be in a forest with predatory witches and wolves than hang out with us, talking about society and politics and all that. The excruciating boredom, but the hypocrisy is what they hate, not our violence, because all the creatures in their forest are violent. It's the hypocrisy of our violence, which they detest. Right, that we're these bad liars walking around pretending to be noble and kind. And that's actually Freud's first insight too, is every cat who walks in my office is lying to me. They're telling me some movie in which they're the star. That's why the last question he ever asks is, tell me about yourself. What a waste of his time. He's just going to get a film reel of, oh, Dr. Freud, I think I'm a very kind person, and I've always tried to be there for my family. And you're the bastard who was just gossiping, trying to ruin someone's reputation 3 minutes ago outside in the waiting room. He knows that. So in a similar way, the question is, do we have the capacity to build zones? If you go back to Tarkovsky's, great movie, Stalker, and you think about what it means to have this, it's like Kafka's castle again. Can you actually construct this willingness to abandon everything like the child does in the fairy tale? And prophets do this in the Bible too, by the way. Abraham leaves his family, his tribe, his possessions to go out into the desert. Some go into the bellies of whales, some go up on mountains and caves. Muhammad does that as a prophetic figure in the Islamic tradition, goes to a cave all day long to listen to the voice of infinity, sacred verses. These are people who will throw away and discard reality for some other sphere, right? And the question of whether or not then something that has imprisoned us in a kind of pseudo-interiority will ever allow us to chase some extraneous sphere.
Well, that brings me to my final question, which has to do with politics, the kind of political commitments that we have on the podcast, amidst actually this narcissistic concern, maybe about the kinds of discussions that we have here too. One of the dominant claims that repeats within the book on evil is that idleness is evil. In fact, there's a sentence, evil is often tied to philosophies of idleness and evanescence, the devil's workshop, laying down in clay, withering. Here on the podcast, we valorize philosophies of idleness, so I thought that was an interesting point to talk about, especially in distinction to the kind of mania that is present in today's world, the mania for labor, the mania for the phone, the constant influx of digital stimulation. And what makes idleness in today's world a kind of evil versus the evils of mania?
Let me say this, as I know that I share and harbor the same revolutionary inclinations and proclivities as everyone else. The book on evil is a book against genocidal war machines and empires. Because evil, if you look at historically, is always an underdog. It's always a subversive movement. It's never the dominant, which is why I really dislike, and with all due respect and credit to the brilliant Hannah Arendt, when she calls Nazism evil, she gives it way too much exotic credit. It is a disgusting, bureaucratic, genocidal war machine that would have purged the entire earth if given enough time and chances. But it's deeply neurotic. And evil is always from the vantage of, again, the loser or the exiled one. If you look at Satan, if you look at Cain, they're the afflicted, they're the banished, they're the unwanted, right? It's never the totalitarian dominant regime. That's not evil. I hate to say it, and I've said it elsewhere, that's the good. That's what we call the good, because these are all utopian ideologies, whether it was Stalinism or fascism or capitalism, that have hundreds of millions of dead bodies to account for. Slavery, Holocaust, gulags, right? Just killing fields on every corner of the earth. These are all leaders who claim to be working for the good. I want to give them the respect of their terminology then. That's what the good looks like to me. Absolute terror, right? Absolute oppression. So for me, evil is always just, again, an escape artist maneuver to try and unbind oneself from that subservience, from that slavehood. For me, then, it is a fundamentally revolutionary technique. Right? To be diabolical is to be elusive. And I'll just say this. Sometimes, I know we've been taught since the great elder Marx that revolution is about struggle and about fighting. And he's a dialectician, so he wants you in the center of the city, causing trouble, fighting head on. But I would just remind you that there are two other forms of resistance that are equally crucial. One is doing nothing. So that's idleness, as you talked about, right? And that's mastered by great decadent figures like Rimbaud, who is young and gay and poor. By the way, he checks a lot of boxes of minorities and of marginalized figures in his time. And his form of resistance is to not work, not become a productive member of modern society, right? To stay at the fringes. So that's one form of resistance that mystics also do a lot. They just check out of the mainstream in that regard. It's what the Beats did by becoming hitchhikers, dropping out of college and all of that stuff. But then another thing is to leave. And this is what I did even with the United States. I got to a point with the US, I'm back here now, but I was gone for 6 or 7 years from the US. And the reason is because it got to a certain threshold of obscenity for me and of just complicity, just feeling like you had blood on your hands just living there every day. That the most radical thing I could think to do was what James Baldwin did, which is just leave. Not go fight, not go storm capitals or pretend I can make a difference or change the fate of the planet. No, just turn my back on this and say, I want nothing to do with this nonsense. I'm not part of this profane little game you're playing. And go elsewhere for as long as you can survive. And that doesn't mean you're clean or, in unadulterated territory. Everywhere on this earth is stained by corruption and oppression and dishonor. And I hate to say, it's most often people claiming to be good and ethical and noble who are behind all of these insidious operations. You can say what you want about my dead master Nietzsche. For all whatever faults he may have had or may have not had, he didn't hurt anybody. And he never claimed to be a good man. He just did his thing, but he didn't hurt people. If you look at any accounts of him, he was not cruel. He was not vicious. He didn't have a sadistic bone in his body. He embodied the generosity of the spirit. I try to be the same as best I can. I try to be generous and kind and affirmative to others. And the way I do that is by never circumscribing myself in an ideology of the good.
Awesome. That's fantastic. Jason, please tell us what's next for you. I know you have another course coming up. You have the 2 books coming out. Let us know where we can access these things.
Hopefully, then what's coming up for me is another great conversation with all of you some months down the line. I'll have more material on the new book on secret societies, which has some great text, books of poison, books of plagues, books of sleep. Oh, that's one of the great things. We didn't get to talk about dream temples in ancient Egypt or the sleep caves of Rome. So I'll throw that out there as just a thread for us to chase after the next time.